I'll never forget the moment that changed everything. His expensive suit couldn't hide the shock in his eyes when that little boy asked, "How much for your leftover food, sir?" And then he just froze. My name's Emma, and I never thought I'd witness something that would completely transform not just my life, but the lives of dozens of children in our shelter. I was just a volunteer, struggling to make ends meet myself, when I saw a wealthy businessman's world turn upside down over a simple question from a hungry child. What happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible to predict how deep the connection would run. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday evening, and I'd been volunteering at the Sunshine Children's Shelter for about 6 months. The shelter was struggling financially, and we barely had enough food to feed the 23 children who call this place home. I'd been stretching our supplies as far as possible, but that night, I knew we'd have to serve smaller portions than usual. The children never complained, though. They'd all been through so much already, and their resilience never ceased to amaze me. As I was preparing the modest meal, I noticed 7-year-old Theo watching me with those big brown eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond his years. "Do you think we'll ever have enough food that I won't feel hungry when I go to bed?" he asked me in that soft voice of his, and I swear my heart shattered into a million pieces. I forced a smile and told him I was sure things would get better soon, though I had no idea how. What I didn't know was that Theo had been developing his own plan, a plan that would set in motion events none of us could have imagined. The shelter was located near an upscale business district, and Theo had been watching the restaurant patrons through our windows, observing how much food they often left behind. I was so caught up in my tasks that I didn't notice Theo slip out the back door. Shelter policy strictly prohibited children going out alone, especially after dark. By the time I realized he was missing, panic had already set in. I rushed outside, frantically calling his name, searching the darkened streets while the worst possibilities raced through my mind. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Theo was wearing only a thin sweater, one of many donated items that never quite fit right. How far could a hungry 7-year-old have gotten in just 15 minutes? And more importantly, what had driven him to leave the safety of our shelter? As I turned the corner, that's when I saw him, standing in front of a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit who had just exited an expensive Italian restaurant. Theo's small frame looked even tinier next to the tall businessman, who was holding a takeout container. "How much for your leftover food, sir?" Theo was asking, his voice clear but trembling slightly in the cold. The man's expression changed from confusion to shock, and then he just froze. Something about this little boy had clearly struck a nerve, and I watched, breathless, as the businessman's perfectly composed facade began to crumble right before my eyes. The businessman stood there, completely still, staring at Theo as if he'd seen a ghost. I rushed over, my heart pounding, ready to apologize and whisk Theo back to the shelter. "I'm so sorry," I started to say, placing my hands protectively on Theo's shoulders. "He shouldn't have bothered you." But the man raised his hand to stop me, his eyes never leaving Theo's face. "It's that birthmark," he whispered, pointing to the small crescent-shaped mark just below Theo's right ear. "Where did you get that birthmark?" The intensity in his voice made me pull Theo closer to me instinctively. "I've always had it," Theo answered simply, his attention still focused on the takeout container. The businessman knelt down, now at eye level with Theo, completely oblivious to his expensive suit touching the dirty sidewalk. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice now trembling. When Theo told him, the man's face went even paler. "And your last name?" Theo looked up at me, unsure if he should answer. "He doesn't have a last name in our records," I explained reluctantly. "He was left at the shelter as an infant with just a first name pinned to his blanket." The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to process this information. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "My son's name was Theodore," he said quietly. "He had the exact same birthmark. He and his mother disappeared 7 years ago." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of bizarre coincidence, or could this wealthy stranger actually be connected to our Theo? The businessman reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal a photo. There was a woman holding a baby, and on the infant's neck was a crescent-shaped birthmark identical to Theo's. "This can't be happening," I whispered, the implications slowly sinking in. The businessman, who had introduced himself as James Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, insisted on coming back to the shelter with us. He didn't even mention the food anymore, though he did give Theo the takeout container, which the boy clutched like treasure. As we walked, James fired questions at me about Theo's arrival at the shelter, his health, his habits, anything that might confirm his suspicions. I answered as best I could, still skeptical, yet unable to ignore the striking similarities. When we reached the shelter, the director, Mrs. Patterson, was waiting at the door, relief washing over her face when she saw Theo, quickly replaced by confusion at the sight of the well-dressed stranger accompanying us. "I need to see your records," James demanded as soon as we were inside, his authoritative tone making it clear he was used to giving orders and having them followed. Mrs. Patterson, who had been running the shelter for over 20 years, was not easily intimidated. "And who exactly are you, sir?" she asked, positioning herself between James and the office door. I quickly explained the situation, watching Mrs. Patterson's expression change from suspicion to astonishment. "We should talk privately," she finally said, ushering James toward her office while instructing me to get Theo settled for dinner. Theo, however, was reluctant to part with his newfound connection. Mrs. Patterson's office was small and cluttered, with filing cabinets that had seen better days. I could see through the glass panel in the door as she pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across her desk. James leaned forward eagerly, examining each document with intense concentration. They were looking at Theo's file, the sparse information we had about his arrival, the police reports that had been filed, the unsuccessful attempts to locate any family. I tried to focus on helping the other children with dinner, but my attention kept drifting to that office, where a potential miracle was unfolding. After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Patterson emerged with James following close behind. Her eyes were red, a clear sign she'd been crying, which was unusual for our tough-as-nails director. "Emma, could you bring Theo to my office, please?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Something significant had happened. When I found Theo, he had shared his precious takeout food with two younger children, watching with satisfaction as they devoured the gourmet pasta that was probably the most delicious thing they'd ever tasted. "Someone wants to talk to you," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. In the office, James knelt down once again to Theo's level, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Theo, I believe I'm your father," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your mother and I were in an accident 7 years ago. I was told that both of you had died." Theo's expression was hard to read, confusion mixed with curiosity and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "But where's my mom?" he asked, the question hanging heavily in the air. James closed his eyes briefly, pain etched across his features. "She didn't survive the accident, son. I was told you didn't either. There was a fire and—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with the memory. Mrs. Patterson then explained what little we knew. A woman had brought Theo to the shelter 7 years ago, claiming to be a distant relative who couldn't care for him. She had disappeared immediately after, leaving behind no information except his first name. The next few days were a whirlwind of DNA tests, legal consultations, and emotional conversations. James refused to leave Theo's side, taking a room at a nearby hotel and spending every waking hour at the shelter. I watched their tentative interactions, the way they studied each other's faces, looking for similarities. Theo was cautious but curious, while James seemed to vacillate between euphoria and devastating grief for the 7 years he'd lost. The DNA results would take a week to come back, but James didn't need that confirmation. He was absolutely certain that Theo was his son, pointing out family traits that went beyond the distinctive birthmark. What surprised me most was James's reaction to the shelter itself. Rather than being repulsed by the shabby conditions, he became increasingly invested in the other children's welfare. He noticed things I'd become numb to: the leaking roof, the worn-out bedding, the insufficient heating system, the meager food supplies. "How do you manage with so little funding?" he asked me one evening as we watched Theo play chess with another boy. I explained about the budget cuts, the failed grant applications, the general public's declining interest in supporting orphanages. "Most people prefer to donate to causes that feel more urgent or trendy," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. James listened intently, asking questions that revealed a genuine interest rather than mere politeness. He wanted to know about each child's story, their needs, their dreams. The other children were initially wary of this wealthy stranger, but soon warmed up to him when he brought in board games, books, and, most importantly, enough food for everyone to eat until they were satisfyingly full. "Is this what it feels like to not be hungry?" 10-year-old Lily asked me in amazement after her first proper meal in months. The transformation in the children's energy and spirits was immediate and heartbreaking, a stark reminder of how basic their unmet needs had been. On the 7th day, James arrived at the shelter with a thick folder under his arm and a look of determination on his face. The DNA results had come back positive. Theo was indeed his son. Legal procedures for custody would take time, but there was no doubt that Theo would be leaving us soon. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Genuine happiness for Theo, who deserved a family and all the opportunities James could provide, but also a selfish sadness at losing him. "I'd like to call a meeting with you and Mrs. Patterson," James announced, his businesslike tone catching me off guard. In the director's office, he opened the folder to reveal architectural plans. "I want to rebuild this shelter," he stated simply, "and I want to establish a foundation to ensure it never lacks funding again." Mrs. Patterson and I exchanged shocked glances, unsure if we were understanding correctly. "I can't change the past 7 years," James explained, his voice heavy with regret. "I can't bring back the time I lost with my son, but I can make sure that other children don't suffer needlessly while waiting for their second chance." The plans he laid out were ambitious. A complete renovation of the existing building, additional space for educational facilities, proper medical care, and a fund that would provide for the children's future education. Mrs. Patterson, who had spent decades begging for every dollar, was speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. I found myself blinking back tears, afraid to believe that such a dramatic change in our circumstances could really be possible. James's proposal wasn't just about money, though. "I want both of you involved in this," he insisted. "You know these children, their needs, what works and what doesn't. I have the resources, but you have the expertise." His respect for our experience, despite our obviously humble positions compared to his corporate status, was genuinely touching. Mrs. Patterson, ever practical, was already peppering him with questions about timelines, budgets, and logistics, while my mind was spinning with possibilities for programs we could finally implement. The art therapy, the tutoring, the sports activities that had always remained wishful thinking due to lack of funds. As word spread among the children, an unusual atmosphere of excitement and hope filled the normally subdued shelter. They drew pictures of their dream bedrooms, classrooms, playgrounds, their imaginations suddenly unleashed by the prospect of what could be rather than the limitations of what is. Even the teenagers, typically guarded and skeptical, allowed themselves to participate in the collective dreaming. Watching them, I realized how rarely these children had been given permission to hope for something better, to envision a future that wasn't just about survival. The psychological impact of James's promise was already transforming our little community. The most remarkable transformation, however, was in Theo. The quiet, serious boy who had always seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders was blossoming in ways I'd never seen before. His newfound security, the knowledge that he belonged to someone, gave him a confidence that was beautiful to witness. Yet, he remained deeply connected to his shelter family, often acting as a bridge between James and the other children, explaining their inside jokes, their fears, their unspoken needs. "When I go to live with my dad," he told me one night as I tucked him in, "I won't forget about everyone here. We're still going to help them, right?" His concern for the others, even in the midst of his own miraculous change in circumstances, brought tears to my eyes. 3 weeks after that fateful evening outside the restaurant, the renovation work on the shelter began. James had expedited everything, leveraging his business connections to cut through red tape and bring in contractors who worked around the clock. We temporarily relocated to a nearby church community center, which James had quickly outfitted with comfortable beds and ample supplies. The children watched in awe as their old home was systematically transformed, walls coming down, new structures going up, a proper playground taking shape in what had been a barren courtyard. Is this real, or am I dreaming? 12-year-old Marcus asked me repeatedly, as if he feared the entire thing might evaporate if he fully believed in it. James, meanwhile, was navigating the complex process of legally reclaiming his son while simultaneously running his company and overseeing the shelter project. I often caught him looking exhausted, making phone calls at odd hours, yet he never complained. "This is nothing compared to what these kids have endured," he said when I expressed concern about his punishing schedule. One evening, I found him sitting alone after all the children had gone to bed, staring at an old photograph. It was the same one from his wallet, Theo and his mother. Her name was Claire, he said softly when he noticed me watching. She would have loved seeing our son now, and she would have loved what we're doing here. As we worked together on a shelter project, James shared more of his story with me. He and Claire had been traveling in a remote area when their car went off the road during a storm. He'd been thrown clear, but knocked unconscious. When he awoke in the hospital days later, he was told that Claire and their son had been trapped in the burning vehicle. Human remains had been found, but they were too damaged for proper identification. James had been devastated, retreating into his work to escape the pain. "I became successful beyond my wildest dreams," he told me, "but none of it meant anything. I was just going through the motions, building wealth I had no one to share it with." The shelter renovation was completed in record time, just 2 months from start to finish. The day we all returned to our transformed home, the children were practically vibrating with excitement. The shabby building they had left behind was now unrecognizable. Bright, spacious rooms with comfortable beds, a state-of-the-art kitchen, classrooms equipped with computers, a library filled with books, a medical office staffed with a part-time nurse. "Is this really our home now?" little Lily asked, her eyes wide as she bounced experimentally on her new bed. Mrs. Patterson, who had overseen the shelter for decades with minimal resources, couldn't stop crying as she walked through the hallways. "I never thought I'd see this day," she kept saying, touching the walls as if to convince herself they were real. While the physical transformation of the shelter was dramatic, the changes in our daily operations were equally profound. With the new Blackwood Foundation providing stable funding, we could finally focus on the children's development rather than mere survival. We hired qualified teachers, counselors, and activity coordinators. The children, who had once spent their days in a holding pattern, waiting for meals, waiting for better circumstances, waiting to age out of the system, were now actively engaged in education, therapy, sports, and arts. Their progress was remarkable, as if they'd all been waiting for the opportunity to show what they were capable of when given the resources and attention they deserved. James and Theo had settled into their new life together, moving into a modest house near the shelter rather than James's previous luxury penthouse. "I want Theo to have a normal childhood, not an isolated, privileged one," James explained. "And I want him to maintain his connections here." True to his word, they visited the shelter several times a week. Theo would join his friends for activities while James met with Mrs. Patterson and me to discuss the foundation's ongoing work. The board he had established included child welfare experts, educational specialists, and former foster children who had navigated the system themselves. "We're going to change how these shelters operate nationwide," he told us, his vision expanding beyond our single facility. What I found most touching was the way James encouraged Theo to develop his own relationship with philanthropy. Rather than simply being the recipient of his father's generosity, Theo was learning to be thoughtful about how to help others. For his 8th birthday, instead of presents, he asked for donations to create comfort packs for children newly arriving at shelters. Backpacks containing a soft blanket, a stuffed animal, books, and personal care items. When I first came here, I was scared and I didn't have anything that was mine, he explained seriously when presenting his idea. I want other kids to have something that belongs to them right away. The project was so successful that the foundation adopted it as a permanent program. 6 months after Theo had asked that life-changing question about leftover food, our shelter hosted an open house to showcase the new facilities and programs. Local officials, potential donors, and media representatives toured the building, visibly impressed by the transformation. James gave a speech, but the real stars were the children themselves, proudly showing visitors their artwork, performing music they'd learned, demonstrating computer skills they developed. I watched from the sidelines, my heart full, remembering how different things had been just half a year earlier. That's when I felt a small hand slip into mine. It was Theo, looking up at me with those wise eyes. "You know what I think?" he said softly. "I think my mom sent me to find my dad that night. And I think she wanted him to find all of you too." That moment with Theo struck me deeply. The innocent wisdom of a child suggesting that perhaps there was some greater purpose behind the coincidence that had brought James into our lives. Whether or not one believed in such spiritual connections, there was no denying that a random encounter had created ripples of positive change affecting dozens of lives already. Mrs. Patterson, who had dedicated her life to caring for unwanted children with minimal support, was now able to implement programs she'd only dreamed of for decades. The other children, who had once faced limited prospects, were flourishing with proper education, nutrition, and psychological support. And James himself had emerged from years of grief-stricken isolation into purposeful action. The story of the millionaire and the orphan boy spread beyond our community, picked up by national media attracted to its fairy tale qualities. James was initially reluctant about the publicity, but came to see it as an opportunity to highlight the broader issues of child welfare and underfunded shelters. If our story can open more hearts and wallets for children in need, then I'm willing to share it, he decided. The attention brought a flood of donations to the Blackwood Foundation, enabling us to expand our work to 3 more shelters in neighboring cities. Each renovation followed the model established at our facility, with input from a staff who knew the children best. What impressed me most about James was that he never treated his philanthropy as charity in the condescending sense. He approached it as both a moral obligation and a sound investment. Every dollar spent on proper care and education for these children now will save society thousands in the future, he would explain to potential donors. This isn't about feeling good for helping the less fortunate. It's about creating a community where everyone has the opportunity to contribute their talents. His business background brought a refreshing practicality to the often emotional field of child welfare, focusing on measurable outcomes while never losing sight of the human element at the center of our work. 1 year after that pivotal evening, we held a celebration at the shelter, not just of the physical transformation of the building, but of the remarkable journeys of its residents. Children who had been failing in school were now earning high grades. Those who had struggled with behavioral issues were showing significant improvement. Teenagers who had been resigned to aging out of the system without prospects were now making college plans with foundation scholarships. Amid the festivities, I found myself standing next to James, both of us watching Theo organize a game for the younger children. "You know," James said quietly, "I spent 7 years thinking I'd lost everything that mattered. I never imagined that finding my son would lead to finding a whole new purpose." He turned to me with unexpected intensity. "Emma, I'd like you to consider taking a leadership role in expanding the foundation nationally. We need someone who understands both the practical needs and the heart of this work." The offer took my breath away, a chance to help implement this model of care on a scale I'd never dreamed possible. I accepted James's offer, and the next 2 years were a whirlwind of activity as we expanded the Blackwood Foundation's work across the country. What had begun as one man's response to finding his son grew into a movement transforming the landscape of child welfare services. James's business acumen, combined with my frontline experience, created a powerful partnership. We developed a model that other organizations could replicate, focusing on comprehensive support rather than merely providing basic necessities. Children need more than just food and shelter to thrive, became our mantra as we presented our approach to government agencies, private donors, and community leaders nationwide. Theo, now 10 years old, had become somewhat of a mascot for our work, though James was careful to protect him from too much public exposure. The once quiet boy had blossomed into a confident, compassionate child with his father's sharp intelligence and a deep empathy born from his early experiences. He often accompanied us on site visits to new shelters, connecting instantly with the children there in a way adults couldn't. They trust him because he was one of them, James observed proudly. He speaks their language. Theo took this role seriously, reporting back to us about what the children really needed or wanted, insights that sometimes contradicted the assumptions of well-meaning adults. The Foundation's work expanded beyond shelter renovations to address systemic issues in foster care and adoption. We lobbied for policy changes, funded research on best practices, and created programs to support families at risk of separation due to poverty. Preventing children from entering the system in the first place is just as important as improving conditions for those already in it, James would explain at conferences and fundraising events. His passion was infectious, drawing in supporters from across the political spectrum. What had once been a personal mission had evolved into a comprehensive approach to child welfare that was gaining national recognition. As our work gained momentum, I sometimes reflected on how it all began, with a hungry child's simple question about leftover food. The butterfly effect of that moment continued to ripple outward, touching more lives than any of us could count. On Theo's 11th birthday, James hosted a celebration at their home, inviting not only Theo's school friends, but also many of the children from our original shelter and the staff who had cared for him. During the party, James pulled me aside, his expression unusually serious. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how close we came to never finding each other," he said, watching Theo laugh with his friends. "If he hadn't left the shelter that night, if he had approached someone else, if I had taken a different route home." He shook his head, overwhelmed by the precariousness of their reunion. Sometimes the biggest changes in our lives hinge on the smallest moments. The ripple effects of Theo and James's reunion continued to spread in unexpected ways. One particularly moving development came when we implemented a national database for connecting separated families, inspired directly by their story. The system was designed to help relatives find children who had entered the foster care system through circumstances similar to Theo's, where paperwork errors, miscommunications, or assumptions had severed family ties. Within the first year, the database facilitated over 200 reunifications, each with its own powerful story of loss and rediscovery. Every time we get a match, I think about how many other Theos and Jameses might be out there, living parallel lives without knowing about each other. I told James after a particularly emotional reunion of a grandmother with grandchildren she'd been told had died in a house fire. As the Foundation's profile rose, James began receiving letters from people all over the country sharing similar stories of family separations and miraculous reunions. Each one affected him deeply, reinforcing his commitment to our work. One letter in particular caught his attention, from a woman who had worked at the hospital where he'd been taken after the accident that supposedly claimed his wife and son. She described a chaotic scene following a major storm, with multiple casualties arriving simultaneously and record-keeping systems failing during a power outage. "I've always wondered if mistakes were made that night," she wrote. "Reading about your story made me certain of it." James launched a quiet investigation, not to assign blame, but to understand exactly how such a devastating error could have occurred. The investigation revealed a series of systemic failures that had led to James being mistakenly informed of his family's death. A misidentified body, paperwork mix-ups during the power outage, assumptions made by overwhelmed staff. More disturbingly, we discovered that similar errors had occurred in other emergency situations across the country, sometimes with equally heartbreaking consequences. James channeled his anger about these findings into constructive action, funding a program to improve emergency protocols and record-keeping systems at hospitals nationwide. No one should ever have to lose years with their loved ones because of administrative errors, he said at the program's launch, his voice thick with emotion. Working closely with James for these past years, I'd witnessed his transformation from a grieving, isolated businessman to a passionate advocate and loving father. The changes in Theo were equally remarkable, from a quiet, hungry child to a confident, thoughtful young person with a unique perspective on privilege and responsibility. Their relationship had evolved into a deep bond, strengthened by their shared commitment to helping others. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraising event, I joined them for dinner at their home. As we sat in their comfortable kitchen, so different from the institutional setting where Theo had spent his early years, I marveled at how naturally they moved together in the space, the easy conversation between them, the inside jokes they shared. You know, I said impulsively, sometimes the universe has strange ways of setting things right. James smiled, reaching over to ruffle Theo's hair affectionately. And sometimes, he replied, it takes a brave little boy asking for leftover food to set the universe in motion. 3 years to the day after that fateful encounter outside the restaurant, we held the grand opening of the Blackwood Family Center, a multifaceted facility combining emergency housing for children, family reunification services, and advocacy work. The center represented everything we'd learned through our experiences with hundreds of shelters nationwide. It was designed not as an institution, but as a transitional home, with spaces that fostered dignity, growth, and healing. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, 12-year-old Theo stood proudly beside his father, no longer the hungry child in ill-fitting clothes, but a poised young person with a clear sense of purpose. When asked to speak, Theo approached the microphone with confidence that belied his age. 3 years ago, I was so hungry that I did something I'd never done before. I asked a stranger for food, Theo began, his voice clear in the hushed auditorium. I didn't know that stranger was my father, or that asking that question would change everything. I just knew I was hungry, and so were my friends at the shelter. He paused, looking out at the assembled crowd of donors, politicians, media representatives, and, most importantly, children and families who had been helped by the Foundation's work. Being hungry isn't just about food. It's about needing things that help you grow, like love, education, safety, and chances to become who you're meant to be. Every kid deserves those things, not just the lucky ones who find their dads. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience as Theo continued, describing his vision for a world where no child would experience the kind of deprivation he had known. James stood nearby, visibly moved by his son's words and the mature compassion they revealed. When Theo finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. A prominent senator in attendance leaned over to me and whispered, "That young man will change the world someday." I nodded in agreement, though I knew that Theo was already changing the world, one project, one policy change, one reunified family at a time. His childhood experience had given him a perspective and moral authority that most privileged children could never possess. Later that evening, at a smaller reception for Foundation staff and close supporters, I found myself reminiscing with Mrs. Patterson about the old shelter, the leaking roof, the perpetual food shortages, the constant struggle to provide even the most basic care. If someone had told me 4 years ago that all this would grow from one child's question, I would have thought they were delusional, she chuckled, gesturing toward the gleaming new facility around us. And yet, here we are. I followed her gaze to where James and Theo were deep in conversation with a group of former shelter residents, now thriving teenagers with educational opportunities that once would have seemed impossible. You know what I think? Mrs. Patterson continued, echoing words Theo had spoken years earlier. I think some things are just meant to be, not to erase the suffering that came before, but to create something meaningful from it. As our work expanded, we began to address not just the symptoms, but the root causes of family separation and child poverty. James leveraged his business connections to create job training and employment programs for parents struggling to provide for their children. Poverty shouldn't be a reason for families to be torn apart, he insisted at board meetings. We need to build support systems that strengthen families rather than dismantling them. This holistic approach, addressing housing insecurity, healthcare access, educational opportunity, and economic stability, set the Blackwood Foundation apart from organizations with more limited scopes. We weren't just improving shelters. We were working to reduce the need for them altogether. Theo, now entering his teens, was developing his own distinct voice within the foundation. While James focused on system-level changes and infrastructure, Theo was passionate about the emotional and psychological aspects of children's experiences. He initiated a program called Kid to Kid, where children currently in shelters could connect with others who had successfully transitioned out, providing peer support that adult counselors, however well-intentioned, simply couldn't offer. When I was in the shelter, I thought my life would always be like that, he explained when presenting the program to the board. Having someone who's been where you are and found a way forward, that can change everything about how you see your future. The media continued to follow our story, particularly as Theo grew older and more articulate about his experiences. A major documentary filmmaker approached us about chronicling the Foundation's work, using Theo and James's reunion as the narrative thread to explore broader issues in child welfare. After careful consideration and family discussions, they agreed to participate with specific boundaries to protect the privacy of other children. If sharing our story helps more people understand these issues and get involved, then it's worth the discomfort of being in the spotlight, James decided. Theo was equally thoughtful. I want people to see that kids in shelters aren't just sad statistics. We're people with dreams and potential, just waiting for a chance. Filming the documentary involved revisiting pivotal locations from their story: the restaurant where they had first encountered each other, the original shelter before its renovation, the hospital where the mistaken death notification had occurred. Each location triggered powerful emotions and reflections. Standing outside the upscale restaurant where Theo had asked about leftover food, James shook his head in wonder. I've been coming to this restaurant for years, drowning my sorrows in expensive meals and barely tasting them. All that time, my son was less than a mile away, sometimes going to bed hungry. The juxtaposition was stark and humbling. Theo, now tall enough that his head reached his father's shoulder, squeezed James's hand reassuringly. "But we found each other eventually," he said simply, "and look at all the good that's come from it." The wisdom in his young voice struck me once again. His ability to acknowledge pain while focusing on possibility rather than bitterness. The documentary, titled Leftover Love, premiered at a major film festival 5 years after Theo and James's reunion. Its impact exceeded our expectations, sparking national conversations about child welfare, family separation, and the often invisible struggles of children in the system. Audiences were moved not just by the personal story at its center, but by the broader issues it illuminated. The underfunding of social services, the bureaucratic failures that separated families, the remarkable resilience of children despite overwhelming odds. Letters and emails poured in from viewers wanting to help, from families sharing similar experiences, from policymakers committed to reform. "This is exactly what we hoped for," James told me as we sorted through the responses. Not just sympathy, but action. Theo, now 14, handled his increased visibility with remarkable maturity. He became a sought-after speaker at youth advocacy events, where his unique perspective as both a former shelter resident and the son of a wealthy philanthropist bridged worlds that rarely intersected. "I've lived at both extremes," he would explain to audiences. "And what I've learned is that the differences aren't as important as what we all need to be seen, to belong, to have opportunities." He was particularly effective when addressing privileged audiences, gently challenging assumptions without inducing defensiveness or guilt. His message was always one of connection rather than division, of shared humanity rather than finger-pointing. As the Foundation's work gained momentum, we began forming partnerships with government agencies to implement our successful models on a larger scale. This wasn't without challenges. Bureaucracies moved slowly. Political considerations sometimes interfered with evidence-based approaches. Funding was perpetually uncertain. James's business background proved invaluable as we navigated these complexities, finding ways to combine public and private resources for maximum impact. We're not here to replace government services, he would explain patiently in meetings with officials. We're here to demonstrate what's possible when we prioritize children's well-being and family integrity. The most rewarding aspect of these partnerships was seeing our pilot programs adopted as standard practice in child welfare departments across multiple states. Our family reunification database, emergency shelter protocols, and wraparound family support services were gradually becoming the norm rather than the exception. Social workers who had initially been skeptical of our outsider approach became some of our strongest advocates after seeing the improved outcomes. One veteran case manager told me, tears in her eyes, "I've been doing this work for 30 years, and for the first time, I feel like we're truly helping families heal instead of just managing crises." These professional validations meant as much to me as the individual success stories of children and families we directly served. By the 6th anniversary of that life-changing encounter outside the restaurant, the Blackwood Foundation had helped transform over 50 shelters nationwide, reunited hundreds of separated families, and implemented supportive programs for thousands more at risk of separation. The statistics were impressive, but behind each number was a personal story, a child who found their way home, a parent who received the support needed to care for their family, a community that rallied around its most vulnerable members. We celebrated these milestones not with lavish galas, but with community gatherings that centered the voices of those we served. The true experts on what works are the people who've lived through these challenges, James would insist when planning these events. As Theo entered high school, he began developing an interest in the legal aspects of child welfare, the policies and precedents that shaped how families were treated by the system. "I want to understand why things work the way they do," he explained when I found him poring over dense legal texts one afternoon at the foundation office. His natural intelligence, combined with his personal experience, gave him unique insights into the strengths and weaknesses of existing frameworks. James watched his son's evolving interests with pride tinged with amusement. "He's got his mother's sense of justice," he confided to me. "Claire was studying law when we met. She would be so proud to see him following this path." These glimpses into their family history, the threads connecting past to present, always moved me. The Foundation's work continued to evolve, responding to emerging needs and incorporating new research on child development and family support. We launched a pioneering program addressing the unique challenges faced by teenage boys in the shelter system, a demographic often overlooked or misunderstood. "I remember how different it felt to be an older boy in the shelter," Theo explained when presenting the initiative to our board. "There's this expectation that you should be tough, that you shouldn't need comfort or guidance. But that's exactly when you need it most." The program included mentorship, emotional support, educational advocacy, and practical skills development, all designed to help young men navigate the transition to independence while healing from past traumas. James's personal transformation remained as remarkable as his professional accomplishments. The driven businessman who had once measured success in profit margins and acquisitions now found fulfillment in relationships and positive impact. He still ran his company, more successfully than ever, in fact, but with a radically different approach to leadership and purpose. Finding Theo didn't just reunite me with my son. He reflected during a rare, quiet moment between meetings. It reconnected me with parts of myself I'd shut down after losing Claire, my capacity for joy, for genuine connection, for seeing beyond my own pain. This evolution was evident in everything from his management style to his personal relationships, including a cautious but deepening friendship with me that had developed over years of working closely together. The documentary Leftover Love was screened in schools, community centers, and policy forums across the country, becoming an unexpected catalyst for grassroots activism around children's issues. In dozens of communities, viewers organized local initiatives inspired by our work, mentoring programs, resource drives for shelters, advocacy campaigns for policy changes. "This is how real change happens," James observed as we tracked these spontaneous offshoots. not just from top-down programs, but from ordinary people deciding they can make a difference in their own communities. We began developing resources to support these local efforts, creating toolkits and training materials that empowered community groups to implement effective interventions without reinventing the wheel. This network of interconnected but independent initiatives became known as the Leftover Love Movement, a name that transformed what could have been a moment of humiliation into a symbol of hope and action. 7 years after our story began, we faced an unexpected challenge that tested everything we'd built. A series of budget cuts at the federal level threatened crucial funding for child welfare services nationwide, potentially undoing years of progress. The political climate had shifted, with some influential voices questioning the government's role in supporting vulnerable families. James, typically measured in his public statements, decided to take a more visible advocacy stance. "This isn't a partisan issue," he insisted during television interviews and congressional testimony. "Children's well-being shouldn't be a political football." Using his business credentials and personal story to bridge ideological divides, he made compelling economic and moral arguments for maintaining and strengthening family support systems. Theo, now 16, chose to join his father in this public advocacy, a significant decision for a teenager who had generally preferred working behind the scenes. "I was one of these kids whose lives are being discussed in abstract terms," he explained when I expressed concern about his increased public exposure. "I think people need to hear directly from someone who's experienced these policies firsthand." His testimony before a congressional committee was powerful in its simplicity and authenticity. Without drama or exaggeration, he described his early years in the understaffed, underfunded shelter, the persistent hunger, the lack of educational support, the absence of individual attention that every child craves. He then contrasted this with the transformation he'd witnessed after proper resources were allocated. The same children who were struggling just to get through each day are now thriving, planning for college, developing their talents, he told the silent committee members. The difference isn't in the children themselves, it's in what we as a society decide they deserve. The combination of James's pragmatic arguments and Theo's compelling personal testimony helped turn the tide of public opinion. A coalition of unlikely allies, progressive advocates, faith communities, business leaders, and family-focused conservatives came together to protect and eventually expand funding for evidence-based family support programs. This experience reinforced what we'd learned throughout our journey. That lasting change required building bridges across divides, finding common ground and shared values despite different ideological starting points. Everyone wants children to thrive, James would remind our team during strategy sessions. Our job is to show how that can happen and make it easy for people from all perspectives to support effective solutions. This advocacy work opened new doors for the foundation, bringing us into closer collaboration with policymakers at state and federal levels. We were increasingly invited to contribute to the development of legislation and regulations affecting children and families, opportunities to embed our hard-won insights into the systems governing child welfare nationwide. Balancing these high-level policy engagements with our continued direct service work required careful attention, as James and I were determined never to lose touch with the day-to-day realities of the families we served. The moment we start thinking about children as statistics rather than individuals is the moment we become part of the problem, James would caution at staff meetings. To maintain this connection, we instituted a practice where every foundation employee, regardless of position, spent time regularly interacting directly with the children and families in our programs, reading to preschoolers, helping with homework, participating in family dinners at our residential centers. As we approached the 8th anniversary of Theo and James's reunion, we organized a special gathering at the original shelter, now a thriving community center serving not only children in crisis, but also families needing preventive support. The event brought together many of the key figures from our journey. Mrs. Patterson, still fierce in her advocacy despite having officially retired. The original shelter children, now young adults pursuing education and careers that once would have seemed impossible, social workers, donors, and community partners who had contributed to the foundation's growth. Watching these individuals interact, their lives connected by a chance encounter that had blossomed into a movement, I was struck by the beautiful unpredictability of human connection. During the celebration, James announced a new initiative that had been developing in quiet conversations over recent months: the Claire Blackwood Scholarship for Law and Social Justice, named for Theo's mother. The program would support education for young people who had experienced the child welfare system and wished to pursue careers addressing systemic inequities. My late wife believed deeply in the power of law to protect the vulnerable and create positive change, James explained to the gathered crowd. This scholarship honors her memory by empowering the next generation of advocates. Theo stood beside his father during this announcement, his expression a complex mixture of pride and the quiet sadness that still emerged when his mother was mentioned. At 16, he had only the faintest memories of her, impressions of warmth and safety rather than clear images. But James had kept her presence alive through stories and photographs. The first recipient of the scholarship was announced that evening: Maria Delgado, who had spent 6 years in foster care before aging out of the system. Now 20, she had completed 2 years of community college while working multiple jobs and volunteering at a local youth shelter. Her application essay had detailed her determination to become a family court attorney who would ensure children's voices were genuinely heard in legal proceedings affecting their lives. When Maria stepped forward to accept the award, her composure momentarily broke. "I never thought someone like me could become a lawyer," she admitted, wiping away tears. "Everyone told me to set more realistic goals. But now I can see a clear path forward." The scholarship would cover her remaining undergraduate education and law school, along with mentorship from attorneys specializing in child advocacy. As the evening progressed, I found myself standing with James and Theo near the center's kitchen, a state-of-the-art facility that produced nutritious meals for resident children and food-insecure families in the surrounding neighborhood. It's hard to believe this is the same place where we once stretched a pot of watery soup to feed 23 children, I remarked, watching the efficient culinary team prepare evening snacks. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" he said. "That container of leftover pasta Theo asked about. Such a small thing, food I wouldn't even have finished at home. And yet, asking for it changed everything." He glanced at his son, who was deep in conversation with Maria about her plans for law school. It makes me wonder how many other pivotal moments we miss every day. Opportunities to connect, to make a difference, to find what we've lost or never knew we needed. 9 years into our journey, the Blackwood Foundation had evolved from a personal mission into a nationally recognized leader in child welfare innovation. Our research department, staffed by professionals who combined academic expertise with lived experience in the system, was producing influential studies on everything from trauma-informed care to educational outcomes for foster youth. These evidence-based insights informed not only our own programs, but also public policy and practices across the country. James, ever the strategic thinker, had positioned the foundation as a bridge between academic research and practical implementation, translating complex findings into actionable approaches that worked in real-world settings. "Knowledge is only valuable when it improves lives," he would remind our research team, pushing them to ensure their work remained grounded in the actual needs of children and families. Theo, now 17 and in his junior year of high school, was emerging as a thought leader in his own right. His unique perspective as someone who had lived on both sides of the socioeconomic divide gave him credibility across diverse audiences. He had developed a particular interest in the role of technology in addressing social challenges, spearheading a project to create a user-friendly app that helped families navigate the often confusing web of available services. "When my dad and I were separated, multiple systems failed us," he explained when pitching the project to potential partners. "What if technology could create safety nets to catch families before they fall through the cracks?" The app connected users to appropriate resources based on their specific needs and location, while also collecting anonymous data that helped identify gaps in service provision across communities. The 10th anniversary of the restaurant encounter was approaching, and James had been unusually reflective in recent weeks. During a late-night strategy session, as we prepared for a major national conference, he shared thoughts that had clearly been percolating for some time. "We've made remarkable progress," he acknowledged, "but I keep thinking about scale and sustainability. How do we ensure this work continues beyond us, beyond our direct involvement?" This forward thinking had always been characteristic of James's leadership. Not content with current success, always looking toward greater impact. "I believe the next phase needs to focus on embedding these approaches within existing systems," he continued. "Not just creating islands of excellence, but transforming the ocean itself." This vision led to our most ambitious initiative yet, a comprehensive plan to reform child welfare at the systemic level, working in partnership with government agencies, academic institutions, community organizations, and, most importantly, families with direct experience of the system. The plan addressed interconnected issues across education, healthcare, housing, economic opportunity, and legal frameworks. Rather than positioning ourselves as outside critics, we sought collaborative relationships with system leaders open to evidence-based improvement. This approach required tremendous patience and diplomatic skill, as it meant engaging with bureaucracies often resistant to change. Real transformation doesn't happen through confrontation alone, James would remind frustrated team members. It requires building trust, finding champions within the system, and demonstrating viable alternatives. This philosophy didn't make for dramatic headlines, but it created the conditions for lasting change that would benefit generations of children long after our individual stories faded from memory. 10 years to the day after a hungry boy asked about leftover food, we gathered once again at the original shelter, now the flagship Blackwood Family Center, to commemorate the journey that had transformed countless lives. The celebration was both reflective and forward-looking, honoring our history while announcing ambitious plans for the future. Hundreds of people attended, from children currently receiving services to policymakers interested in replicating our models. Media coverage was extensive, with many outlets contrasting before and after images of the shelter and interviewing individuals whose lives have been touched by the Foundation's work. The most powerful testimonials came from young adults who had been children in the original shelter, their achievements and stability reflecting the profound difference that proper support could make in vulnerable lives. Theo, now 18 and preparing to graduate high school, gave a speech that moved many to tears. No longer the small, hungry child of a decade ago, he stood tall and confident as he addressed the gathering. 10 years ago, I was desperate enough to approach a stranger and ask for his leftover food, he began, his voice steady. I couldn't have imagined then that this moment of desperation would lead to finding my father, my identity, and ultimately my purpose. He went on to share reflections on his dual perspective as someone who had experienced deep deprivation and remarkable privilege within a single lifetime. These contrasting experiences have shown me that the differences between us are largely circumstantial, he observed. The same children who struggle in underfunded shelters flourish when given resources and opportunities. This isn't about charity. It's about recognizing and nurturing the potential that exists in every child, regardless of their starting point. James followed Theo at the podium, visibly moved by his son's words. 10 years ago, I was a successful businessman by conventional metrics, but an empty shell of a person, he admitted candidly. Finding my son didn't just reunite me with him. It reconnected me with humanity, with purpose, with joy. He then outlined the Foundation's vision for the next decade, expanding our evidence-based models internationally, developing new approaches for preventing family separation before it occurred, and creating pathways for individuals with system experience to become leaders in policy and practice. The next chapter of this work will be led by those who understand these issues not just intellectually but personally, he announced, gesturing toward Theo and other young adults who had experienced the system firsthand. Their leadership will take us places we cannot yet imagine. As the formal program concluded and guests mingled, I found myself standing with James and Theo in a quiet moment. The three of us had walked such a long path together, from that first chaotic night to this milestone celebration. You know what I've been thinking about lately? Theo said, echoing his father's frequent reflection. How different things might have been if I hadn't left the shelter that night, or if I'd approached someone else, or if Dad had taken a different route home. He paused, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. I used to think it was just luck that brought us together, but now I see it differently. It wasn't just about us finding each other. It was about all of this. He gestured toward the bustling community center around us, the visible evidence of a chance encounter transformed into purposeful action. Maybe the universe doesn't just connect people randomly. Maybe it connects those who are ready to create something larger than themselves. James placed his hand on his son's shoulder, pride and love evident in his expression. Whatever brought us together, he said softly, I'm grateful every day that you had the courage to ask for what you needed. In that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of their remarkable journey, I understood that their story had never really been about a millionaire and an orphan. It had always been about the transformative power of connection, the ripples that spread outward when hearts open and lives intertwine. What an incredible journey we've witnessed over these 10 years. From a desperate moment outside a restaurant to a nationwide movement transforming thousands of lives. This story reminds us that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest actions. A child's brave question, a moment of recognition, an open heart. What would happen if you approached life with this same awareness? How might you notice the theos crossing your path today? Not just in dramatic rescue scenarios, but in everyday moments of potential connection. Are you moving through life with eyes open to these possibilities? Or are you, like James once was, sleepwalking through success without meaning? The power of this story lies in its reminder that transformation works in both directions. While James certainly changed Theo's material circumstances, Theo equally transformed James's spiritual and emotional life. This is the true nature of authentic connection. It's never one-sided, never just about the privileged helping the less fortunate. It's about the magic that happens when human beings truly see each other across divides. I challenge you to carry this awareness into your day. Look for unexpected connections. Consider how your leftover resources, not just material goods, but your time, attention, skills, and influence, might be exactly what someone else needs. And remember that in that exchange, you may receive something far more valuable than what you give. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Each week, we share these powerful human stories that remind us of our capacity for connection and transformation. Leave a comment sharing a moment when an unexpected encounter changed your life. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.